Hey there everybody, Nick here from Absolute MTG, and I'm back with another deck tech for you. Today, I'm bringing you red-white vehicles for the standard format, and as you guys can notice, there's something a little bit different about the deck tech this time around. We have a brand new layout, and it's something that I think you guys are really going to enjoy. I took some time to put this layout together, and I think that this is going to be a much better approach at deck techs and just trying to get the comprehensive message of what the decks actually do and what you should be doing for sideboarding, because that was something that we didn't really focus on a whole lot previously. That is the sideboarding, and it's something that we're going to be doing a whole lot more in the future, and it's something that we are going to focus on heavily, I want to say. So without further ado, red-white vehicles. So this isn't as much vehicles as it is red-white aggro. It's pretty much just kept the name from the previous iterations that we've had of this deck, where they did actually play more vehicle cards in here, but now it's just red-white aggro with value stuff and Copter. That's basically what the name should be, just red-white good things. But with this deck, the difference with the deck list that I'm playing and the other stuff that you might see is that we're playing Avacyn in this deck, and we're playing more Gideons. So that is to say that our curve is a little bit higher on the tail end when we're playing our 4 and 5 drops, but it makes our deck overall just a whole lot better against the stuff that our opponents could be playing. So rather than play like more copies of Depala and Pia and stuff like that, we're shaving down those copies to be able to play cards that are more suitable for the variety of matchups that we are going to encounter. The sweet thing about this deck is because we're already playing the Selfless Spirits in here, we have the manipulation of being able to sack the Selfless Spirit for indestructibility while the Avacyn's out, and then be able to trigger the Avacyn so it would flip and nuke the board. So that's usually pretty great whenever you're playing up against like other aggro decks, if you're playing against like blue-white flash, just because being able to clear out the board and leave your opponent with like little to nothing is exactly what we want, and the flipped Avacyn itself is nothing to laugh at. That card's like absolutely insane, and especially whenever we throw into the mix that we can flash that card in as a manipulation towards damage and removal or anything that our opponent might have in that way, shape, or form is pretty awesome. So other than that, the main board's pretty much the same that you would expect. We're still playing the key cards in this archetype. We're playing the Inspectors, Toolcraft Exemplar, Veteran Motorist. All those cards are 4-ofs for us. Some of the decks go up or down on the copies of Selfless Spirit that they're going to play. Realistically, you don't need to play 4 of them in this deck. I found that 3 works just as fine for us, and you get the benefit of having them in there for like Avacyn, but at the same time, you can have it in there for the early game where you need to mitigate your opponent's removal, assuming they don't just play like a bunch of like Grasp of Darkness type effects. But Selfless Spirit in and of itself is great. I wouldn't play anything less than 3 personally, but I think 3 to 4 is exactly where you want to be at. Thalia, Heretic, Cathar is another card that just goes up and down in copy numbers, but I've found that if you're playing a 2-2-2 split with your 3 drops with Thalia, Pia, and Depala, that's the exact sweet spot that you want, and you don't see way too many of them because they're legendary. But contrary to that, we are playing one more Thalia in the sideboard because in some of the matchups we want to have another copy because that card's like absolutely insane. But otherwise, we basically have the basic package for red-white vehicles that you would expect. Our removal pretty much breaks down into 3 Deccan Stone, 3 Stasis Snare, both of which are applicable and unique for different matchups for one reason or another. We might side up or side down on them based on what we're playing against, as mainly being like whether we're playing against like Marvel or whether we're playing against things like green-black mid-range or Delirium decks of that nature. So we want to be aware of what we're playing against, and we'll get into sideboarding with those guards in a little bit here. But it's basically what you would assume for a red-white vehicles deck, but I've found that if you're going higher in your curve with this deck, you're going to do far better than if you're just committing to playing like 3 or 4 Depalas, like 3 Pias, or even just more Thalias. The more of those cards you play, they tend to be redundant, and diversifying your cards seems to be much better in this deck style. Now, for the first matchup that we're going to be discussing for the sideboard guide, we are going to be talking about the mirror match. So for the mirror match, we don't really like cards like Pia, the Toolcraft Exemplar, or Stasis Snare. Basically, the mindset is that the Stasis Snares are going to side into Galvanic Bombardments just because they're cheaper removal for us. Toolcraft Exemplar usually shouldn't be like attacking through board states just because it's realistically just going to chump into something else, and your opponent's just going to be trading one for one. And especially if your opponent has something like a Thalia out, it's not really going to effectively get through. With that, we still keep cards like Thraben Inspector in just because Inspector has a ulterior benefit for it where we have the clue, we can crack the clue for drawing a card, so we don't really lose anything for playing our Inspector, but cards like Toolcraft Exemplar on their own aren't really that impressive. The Pia itself also isn't very impressive just because it's not really generating anything for us, and usually like sacrificing the one artifact to make one of our opponent's creatures not be able to block isn't good because they're going to have multiple creatures. So the mindset is we side out Pia, Toolcraft Exemplar, and Stasis Snare in turn for more removal in form of Galvanic Bombardment, Fragmentize, and Deck and Stone, especially the Deck and Stone because our opponent is probably going to side in more Gideons, or rather just keep their copies of Gideon that they already have, and they're going to clutter up the board state. And on top of that, we also side in another copy of Gideon ourselves, so we can clutter up the board state, but also it gives us synergy with Lantern Scout, which, with the rally effect, whenever it or another ally, which Gideon makes, enters the battlefield, it's going to give a lifelink to our creatures. So with that, we can attack through, and we can assure that we're much farther ahead of our opponent in what we're trying to do with aggro. Alright, so now our Aetherworks matchup is not really that great. If I could play against like any other deck, I would prefer it over playing against the Aetherworks deck. This matchup is awkward just because if our opponent gets the most optimal setup of cards, there is a very, very good likelihood that we're just not going to be able to do anything at all. With this matchup, we are going to be siding out our cards that are going to punish us more than they're going to provide any sort of good benefit for us actually having them in our hand when our opponent actually goes and Emrakul's us. So with Pia has that clause that says sacrifice an artifact, target creature can't block this turn. The reason why that's bad is because they can sacrifice our clues, our copters, and even like the thopters that we get off the Pia, and they can just make them go away by wasting our mana. So that's really, really bad for us. Deck and Stone is equally as bad because our opponent can animate our Gideon, use our Deck and Stone on our Gideon, otherwise use it on our creatures. The fact that Deck and Stone can hit our stuff is bad, and it's not a good answer to Emrakul. So going into Game 2 and Game 3, we have to settle that we can't play either of these cards because even though Deck and Stone is insane against Ishkana, we have to just settle that we are going to play the game without them because if our opponent sees the Emrakul, it's just much, much more harmful for us than it's actually helping us with our opponent just playing a natural Ishkana on turn 5 or anything close to it. Now, with the stuff that we're siding in, we're bringing in Fragmentizes to actually hit the Aetherworks. We have another Gideon to just provide more pressure for the board, and it itself can turn itself into a 5/5, so we can just start smashing the board a little bit more. Chandra's in there for basically the same reason. It's just another Planeswalker threat that's going to sit on the board. It's almost like it's going to provide us another draw for the turn. If we reveal a land off the top, we're just hitting them for 2 damage regardless. But it can also provide mana for us if we need to clutter up the board. If we know that we don't really have to worry about like a Kozilek's Return, maybe we have like a Selfless Spirit that's just going to be able to eat up the Kozilek's Return in general. There is a bunch of stuff that you can do with the Chandra that's usually pretty good. And the Thalia in general is just really great at playing against Ishkana and also playing against an Emrakul, so your opponent can't really run anything into the Emrakul itself, but mainly it's just kind of a foolproofing for the Ishkana turns where your opponent maybe will activate their Marvel and they get something off of it, but it's an Ishkana, so it and all of the tokens are going to enter in tapped, which is great for us. So that's what we want to aim for. We want to aim for getting our Thalias. Hopefully they don't kill them with like a Harness Lightning or anything like that, and we just out-tempo our opponent before the Aetherworks actually does stupid, insane stuff that it usually does. The black-green Delirium matchup, on the other hand, is actually a pretty good one. With this, we are basically going to be taking out the Toolcraft Exemplars and the Pias because they are very susceptible to any small board wipes that our opponents may have. So your opponent might just sweep the board for 3 mana and give all of your dudes -2/-2, which is kind of awkward because that's basically like what all of our creatures are. They're X2s. So we side out the Toolcraft Exemplars and the Pias. Those cards really aren't as impressive for us. We also side out a Stasis Snare just because our opponent is bringing in cards like Natural Estate or Appetite. So we side out all of these to bring in another deck in stone. Against the black-green Delirium matchups, because they're not playing like a combo deck that gets Emrakul out pretty consistently, the card that we do have to worry about in the matchup is actually just Ishkana. So whenever we're playing against like Ishkana decks that don't just flood the board with Emrakuls, we can take care of the tokens or the Ishkana itself quite easily, and then we just keep on pounding the board and just out-tempoing our opponent before they do anything that's real. We're also bringing in the Gideon just because it provides more pressure. Planeswalkers are kind of hard for the Delirium deck to deal with. They need very specific cards to be able to get rid of them, or otherwise allocate their resources, like attacking with Grim Flayers, towards the Gideon itself. So the more they distract themselves from like attacking us, getting any triggers and stuff like that, it just allows us to do more things with less regard for like them setting up the perfect sequence of cards. Our Chandra is insane in this matchup, again, for the same reason, like as Gideon, they can't really deal with Planeswalkers very well, so if we bring in a bunch of Planeswalkers, they tend to be, like, on the back foot for the most part. And Thalia in general, like we explained in the previous example with Aetherworks, when we're playing against like Shikana decks, Thalia just ends up being really, really good. And in general, like any of their other cards that they might play, like Mind Rack, Demon, any Grim Flayers that they might resolve, even like Tireless Tracker, whatever the case may be, any of their creatures and their non-basic lands entering the battlefield tapped is awesome, especially if they're playing like Evolving Wilds, Blighted Fen, cards of that nature. It ends up being really, really awkward for them to play out their deck, and they have to start shifting their removal for cards like Thalia and getting rid of those before they end up playing too far behind because their stuff's entering in tapped. But Gideon and Chandra are definitely the heavy hitters in this matchup. Those are the cards that you really want to stress heavily on trying to like resolve and keep those things alive. And the Chandra alone being removal, it can get rid of Grim Flayers even if they have their Delirium, which is great. And it itself can just keep on pointing damage at your opponent. It can kill Liliana, which is kind of great as well if you need some combined damage to actually get rid of it. But ultimately, Black-Green Delirium is actually a pretty good matchup. If you're well-versed with the deck, it shouldn't be hard to beat at all. Usually what will end up happening is you get some easy 2-0s with them for the most part. And the last deck that we are going to be talking about here for the sideboard guide is the Blue-White Flash matchup, which is, again, another pretty favorable matchup. So I ended up playing in a PPTQ where 5 of the 8 rounds that I played against Blue-White Flash, and I realized that the matchup is just so heavily in your favor. It's like insane. Your opponent can't match your tempo, and all the stuff that they try to play, they have to exchange card for card. Usually, if you, in the early game, exchange card for card with them so that they don't have a board state, you resolve a Gideon when they're, like, tapped out, you can just win the game super easy. One thing to remember with that matchup is that they're going to keep mana open for Spell Queller, but more importantly, they're probably going to keep mana open for Stasis Snare, so animating your Gideon probably isn't the wisest idea against them unless you know that they don't have a Stasis Snare or they don't have the appropriate mana up for a Stasis Snare. So that's like one thing to keep in mind. Again, with them, Toolcraft Exemplar shouldn't really be able to efficiently get through. They play Inspector as well, so trading an Inspector for Toolcraft Exemplar doesn't feel like the best exchange. They're also playing a bunch of creatures, so Pia's not really going to give us much actual value out of being able to sack the artifacts towards anything. And the Stasis Snare is less impressive, even though it can hit their Avacyns and their Gideons. It's less impressive because they're playing Fragmentize, so it's much less appealing for us to play that whenever we know our opponent is actually just siding in removal against us that can answer those cards. Another approach that you can take towards sideboarding, which I'm not going to discuss as much, it's something that I've done in the past, that you can side out the Toolcraft Exemplars and you can side out your Copters as well. And the Stasis Snares, so that way you give your opponent absolutely 0 cards that they can Fragmentize, other than like the Thraben Inspector creating a clue, but even that, like if your opponent's using a Fragmentize on that, that's just garbage. If you side out your Exemplars, your Stasis Snares, and your Copters against an opponent that maybe you know they play like 3 or 4 Fragmentizes because they're trying to hedge in the matchup, if you do that against them inside a little bit differently, if you're playing like Bushwhackers and stuff in the sideboard, you end up getting you get like a really, really insane matchup against them where they have a bunch of dead cards. And that's actually what I did for that PPTQ as something that I like wanted to take as an approach to catch people off guard. But once people know you're doing it, not really that impressive. But we side out the Pia Exemplars, Stasis Snare, bring in Fragmentizes that are just good overall. Tears of Valakut hits their flying dudes. Chandra and Gideon just give us additional value, and Deck and Stone is great for clearing the board of any Gideon tokens. That's basically the mindset for Deck and Stone, is you want to clear their tokens because they're going to gum up the board just as much as you're going to. And there you guys have it. That is the guide for red-white vehicles before Aether Revolt comes out for us. This deck is really, really good. Like I mentioned with the PPTQs, I ended up winning a PPTQ with this deck, where the previous weeks I played in 3 previous PPTQs. The past weeks where I top 8'd but didn't get there, I lost in either semifinals or finals. And it's really depressing whenever you get really, really close and then don't end up winning the event. But we finally got there with red-white vehicles. The deck is pretty insane. It has a lot of good matchups. Aetherworks is kind of an annoyance now, but if you are smart, you're able to out-aggro them. It shouldn't be a problem whatsoever. If you guys enjoyed the deck tech and want to see more videos like this, especially with talking about sideboards and whatnot, please be sure to hit the thumbs up button, leave me any comments, and form any discussions or feedback down in the comment section below. And remember to subscribe for a bunch of new content and sweet stuff to come. And check out the links down in the description below. Until next time, guys, thank you for watching, thank you for joining me, and peace out. And then moving on, we have our Aetherworks Marvel matchup, which is just pure garbage because Emrakul is like the best card in the format, and that deck plays like 4 of them, and it's just this stupid bowl of spaghetti. Dude's just swimming in the sketties, and what are we supposed to do? Just deal with a 13-13 on turn 4? That's like not real. I don't know what you want from me, Wizards.